Hello and welcome to the Sage Oak Show, Senior Care Simplified. I'm your host, Christina Hodak, and my guest today is Brian Harmon, who is a physical therapist, owner and founder of Nexus Home Health. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're very glad to have you on with us today. We hope that we can dive into some interesting information about home health that a lot of families may find educational and interesting all alike. So tell us first, how did you get to your background as being a physical therapist before you were an owner of the company, of course. So how did you get to the pathway of going as being a clinician and working as a clinician to owning your own company?
This long process. I started off as a physical therapist. I spent probably 10 years or so in sports medicine and orthopedics. And then when we moved back to Florida, I got an opportunity to work in home health, which was a new environment for me. And initially, I didn't care for it because in sports medicine clinics, you're seeing multiple patients. They're just kind of stacked. And so you're constantly moving. And so going from that to one-on-one in somebody's home was a big slowdown. It was a big shift for me. And within about 6 months, I fell in love. Like, this is the place I want to be. And what you realize as you're in patients' homes is that there's a lot of insights that you gain from that environment that I would never get in a clinic environment.
Absolutely.
And then you start thinking further, and really where the biggest need for healthcare is obviously in an aging population. So you combine all these things together. It's like, this is really what I was designed to go do. So I was in clinical roles and leadership roles with various larger, smaller home health companies. Spent some time working in research, and then just through some events, ended up purchasing this agency on our own last January, and we've been running ever since.
I think it's wonderful that you decided to own a healthcare company and you are a clinician. To me, that's super important. My background is geriatric nursing, and that's why I think I fit so well into the senior care industry. It's because I came from a clinical side before I was in an administrative role.
That's right.
So
it gives you a different perspective. You know, if an accountant or an attorney owning, a healthcare company or running a healthcare company, or even these MBAs, I have an MBA as well. It's just a very different perspective when you are in the clinical work itself. In fact, myself, I still treat. I keep a limited caseload, but all of my directors and my lead folks, they all treat as well, because the second that you start getting out of the field, I think it becomes more of a business, and you forget why you're there in the first place, and you don't gain any additional information or insights or ahas if you're not in the field, in the working with patients, working with families, working with senior living communities. There's a lot that you gain from those experiences that sitting in an office or out doing sales calls or doing these kind of conversations, which I enjoy, I don't gain as much as if I'm with patients.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And with that background, you know what to focus on within your company.
Right.
Of course, the focus is on restoring, strength and balance to your patients, but it can also be focused on something that's not necessarily restorative, but rather preventative.
That's correct. Yes.
I think that the preventative side, at least from what I have seen in our residents and families that come to us, it seems like people typically turn to home health care and in-home therapy once there has been a significant event to occur.
You got it.
But a lot of people, maybe they don't even realize that they do have the benefit with a lot of their insurance that they can get therapy and start building strength before they have a catastrophic event.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that for us.
So it's a subject that is near and dear to my heart, because we get to see the end result once the bad things start to happen, right? And so, we live in an interesting world now where, 200 years ago, the average lifespan was like 38, and now we're roughly 80. So we're living in a time where we have much older bodies, a lot more wear and tear, and so there's a lot of degenerative issues that are happening, and so there's a use case for using therapy and those kind of modalities prior to the bad things happening. Because once the bad things start to happen, the new baseline is lower, and then another bad thing happens, and the baseline's lower. And so our perspective is we have some. I own a clinical model, and we look at well over 100 different data points that are attributed to risk factors and success rates in seniors. And so based on what we see with those things, it helps us to it helps illuminate rather the areas of concern, so we can go tackle those things. So what ends up happening is now while we're working with someone who's already maybe had that decline, we're starting to set them up for the future in prevention. And so, in particular with like working with senior living communities, one of the things that we try to educate them on is anytime there's somebody that's new moving in, the 90% of the reason why they're moving in is some sort of a loss of function, or there's a medical decline or something. And so they're already seeing something, they themselves or the family members are already seeing something that's happening, and they're starting to need some additional help. And so my perspective is I would like for all of those new residents to see therapists, maybe not the nursing part, but for sure the therapy part, to make sure that the environment is set up that's conducive for them. What kind of furniture are we bringing in? What's the furniture layout look like? Is there caregiver training that needs to happen? And so if we can do those things on the front end, then maybe we can delay some of the downturns, or the downturns don't become so severe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think you hit on furniture layout, and especially when you're moving into a community like Sage Oak, where it's either assisted living or memory care, there's some things that you have at home that you don't necessarily need any long. You probably don't need them at home, but you certainly don't need them once you move into a senior care living center. Can you highlight what some of those items may be?
Yeah, I think the major things that we see is the bed sizes, and it's not necessarily too wide or too small. It's a lot of it. Sometimes it's the mattress itself that they're using. Sometimes it is the size of the bed, whether it's too wide or too tall or too small. A lot of times we run into people who want to bring in their rocker swivel recliners. And if you're somebody who's already starting to struggle getting up and moving around, and there's some balance issues and maybe there's some strength issues, like trying to push up on a chair that is constantly moving on you,
it's hard.
It's not usually a good mix. So some of those kind of things, usually in senior living communities, y'all are really good about, there's wider open doorways, there's no rugs on the ground. So some of that kind of stuff we don't really run into. Usually if it's a furniture related issue, it's too much, too large, or it's the wrong type, it's not stationary enough.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't put rugs down, but we do absolutely run into that with families because they want that warmth, and they feel like, a lot of people also feel like having that rug or even carpet in Sage Oak, we have all, wood floors or tiled floors. And a lot of times families will be like, oh, I really like it, but there's no carpet. And we're like, well, there's a reason for that. There's a method to the madness, right? Walkers don't push as easily if it's on carpet, wheelchairs, but certainly rugs are a trip hazard.
They can be.
And even if you fall on carpet versus falling on a hardwood floor, have you seen in your practice that there's a big difference in injury rate?
That's fascinating. No, honestly, I think if you think about it, it feels like you would hurt worse if you fall on tile versus carpet. And there's probably something on that. What's really interesting, though, is so we'll do a sidebar conversation.
Sure.
There's a thing called a hip protector.
Yes.
And these things were like all the rage about 10 years ago. And what a hip protector is it's like hockey, like the goalie pants, like bike shorts.
Yeah, like padded underwear.
With built-in pads, right? And so it's kind of like Spanx. And so it's Spanx with a function. But anyway, so the idea behind them was if you fall, because there's now some additional padding, then the theory is we're going to see fewer fractures. And those things were on for several years. These things went on, were being sold, and finally they started to do some research because they started to see maybe anecdotally we're not seeing the results that we thought we were going to see. And so they did take, it's probably been a couple years now, they took some nursing homes. They had a group of nursing homes where everyone wore the hip protectors, and they had a group of nursing homes where they didn't wear them, and they found no change in hip fractures. And so now, what our prevailing theory now is, in most cases, that the hip fracture is actually the thing happening first. That's what's causing the fall, and not the other way around.
Yeah.
But if it's me and I'm worried about falling, I probably want to have a little extra padding.
Well,
yeah.
Well, that's true. Yeah. So, we do come across that. Size of furniture is another big thing, because a lot of people, especially moving into, one of our Sage Oak communities, they've had a whole house full of large furniture. Now you don't need that anymore, especially when we get to our residents that have cognitive impairment. Smaller really is better. That's kind of our motto for everything at Sage Oak. We like smaller, more intimate size settings. That comes with rooms as well. They're just easier to navigate. You can't fill them with as much, or you shouldn't fill them with as much stuff.
Well, and to y'all's credit too, when you keep rooms small like that, there's a natural tendency to want to be out in the community,
Yeah.
where it's easier for caregivers to keep eyeballs on people and that kind of stuff. And so I think it helps from that end too. But you're right, like the downsize thing is a major issue. You've spent 70 years acquiring all this stuff, and now all of a sudden you're going to go to a much smaller room. And so there is a transition, and there's probably some psychological stuff that goes through that.
Oh, yeah.
As they're having to say goodbye to goods and things that they've had for their entire life. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So another common confusion that families have when they come to us, when they're asking, do we think that the resident may need home health? And, if we think that it would probably be beneficial to get you guys to come out and evaluate them or something, they don't know the difference between physical therapy versus occupational therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. As a general rule, and it shouldn't be this way, but this is kind of how we treat it in the industry. Everything from like the waist down typically is done by PTs, and everything from the waist up, so the arms, are done by OTs. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. OTs actually historically have been trained on home modifications and equipments and those kind of things for what we call activities of daily living. So if your joints or your muscles or your hands don't work as well, there are adaptive equipment that the OTs are generally more well versed in than a physical therapist is. But what we typically find in this, and in like anything post-acute, so think anything outside of a hospital, outside of like an orthopedic clinic. So in skilled nursing facilities, in rehab hospitals, in home health, usually you just see the dividing line as OTs do upper and PTs do lower. It's kind of how they do that. Yeah.
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 So your company offers both, correct?
We do both, yeah. So we have a different philosophy, a different clinical philosophy. So we actually train PTs to kind of treat like OTs. And so we are very functional based. In fact, all of our scoring tools are based off of those kind of things. And then we employ a lot of adaptive equipment and home modifications, those kind of things, to help make sure that the systems that sustain life essentially are being met safely and consistently. But we do use OTs if we have someone who's had like a recent stroke and we need some specific arm rehab, then we'll use OTs for that.
So it kind of gives you the best of both worlds.
We feel like that, yeah.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
I know, Brian's company operates in the Dallas area. We use Nexus Home Health with some of our residents at Sage Oak in Dallas, and it's really easy to talk about what a great company you guys are and how you treat your patients and our residents. So we're fortunate to have you guys in the area.
Thank you, yeah.
No problem. Thank you.
We enjoy, the caregiver training aspect is another thing. When we're working with patients in assisted livings in particular, while the end user of those services is really the patient, one of the things that we train all of our clinicians on is really it's the facility, the community that we're really trying to pour into. And so we want to make sure that by the time we're discharging Mrs. Smith, that one, the systems are in a good place for her, but also that the caregivers feel comfortable and they're well trained and they understand how to use whatever equipment we brought in, or whatever transfer details that we've modified or whatever. So we want to make sure you guys are well set up as well.
That's very important. We have certainly benefited from your caregiver training in the communities in Dallas as well. That's a big deal, to find a senior living community that partners well and communicates well with other, healthcare companies that are on board with us, and to have them do that and reciprocate that. It's very rare to find, but it's super important. I think families need to know that talk to, whether you're moving in with Sage Oak or someone else, talk to that company, ask them how they communicate with other home health companies. What is that dialogue? A lot of times you get several people trying to treat the same resident, and there's not that back and forth, and so you can have some misfires when that occurs, when you don't have that open line of communication.
And it goes to both at the facility level and the home health level, right? Because there's certainly some communities that we enjoy really tight relationships with, like Sage Oak, and then there's other ones that I think it's just their business model is more kind of hands off. They don't really want to touch the healthcare part of it. The problem is with that is, in my opinion, I'm always obviously biased because I'm on the healthcare side of it. When you have older adults moving into assisted living, there are healthcare needs whether you want to pay attention to them or not.
That's
and so
very true.
if you're going to have healthcare needs, you probably should have some really tight relationships with providers that are coming to your campus. And so, I think that communication goes both ways. I think the downside of and maybe every other industry is this way. I just know we feel it in healthcare where a lot of times we have these silos, and I think sometimes our own actions help to reinforce those silos, and so we try to be very cognizant of, we don't want that. The patient is ultimately the biggest benefactor, or your resident is the biggest benefactor of all of us working together, and it's going to take a collaborative effort to do that. And we can't just have nurses and therapists coming in, not talking with anybody, not doing any kind of education or highlighting things that are of concern to the caregiver staff, because the caregivers are overwhelmed too, right? They know they're dealing with some higher acuity, some older and sicker individuals, and sometimes that's scary. Sometimes you're not really sure, like, when do I report these things? And so it's helpful for them to have somebody to contact, to text or call or whatever, and go, hey, here's what I'm seeing. What do I do with this? And so I think that relationship benefits the patient ultimately, but all of us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you ever have a scenario where you may be treating someone in their home, not necessarily senior living community, in their home, and you identify that maybe it's time for a little more help than just us coming to your house every day?
Every day we get to
So
that,
how do you approach those conversations with the families when that comes up?
Carefully. There's a lot of, I would say, salesmanship, but I think you have to understand that you're dealing with older individuals who have gotten used to certain systems, their lifestyle, all their stuff is in their home. And so the conversation to move from that to another facility or to a facility or community is sometimes a tough one. And so we have the benefit of having some very specific objective measures that we can go and share with family members and go, here's where your risk factors are. Here's what these scores put you in. And so when we're having those discussions, it is very helpful to have something objective to refer back to, so that we can go, okay, these clearly are issues. How in this environment are we gonna get these things solved? And a lot of times we can just do that through bringing in some additional, private duty caregiver support. But as hours increase, that gets the expense can get pretty up there. So then it starts to look at, okay, what kind of what other resources or what other communities can we look into that are better fit for mom or dad?
Well, when it does look like it's beyond just a private duty caregiver coming in, what are some things that families should look for when selecting an assisted living community or memory care community?
Great question, because you guys, there's a lot of options here.
There's some
really, really great ones here. I will tell you, I work with a bunch of them, and they are awesome. And then there are some that are just they would not be ideal. I would definitely look at caregiver ratios. I think the number one thing that I find and that my team finds in assisted livings, and remember, we're also ones who are very collaborative with the building. So we are more sensitive to the fact of if there's limited caregiver support or limited collaboration.
Right.
We feel that directly in terms of not just the frustration of there's nobody here to go to, but also we feel it because I'm not discharging that patient until these systems are in place.
Yeah, you can't be as successful in your company either.
And I can't have that, if I don't have good communication or collaboration with the caregivers there, then I can't get my goals met for this particular resident. So I would pay attention to the caregiver support. Honestly, I think that's probably the number one thing. Caregiver support is probably the number one thing. Usually the smaller buildings are better fitted for that. And it doesn't mean that the bigger buildings aren't still fine. I work with a couple really large buildings and they do fantastic work.
Oh, sure.
But the resident that they cater to, by its very nature, is going to be much more independent.
Yeah.
And so I think depending on I think the other qualification thing would be depending on how much need you have. If you're fairly independent, you just need a few things to be helped with. I think some of the larger facilities are okay. If you are waiting until later and now it's like I need help with a lot of things, I would probably venture to go with something more mid-size or smaller size because the caregiver support and the ratios are just better.
Yeah, we absolutely feel that way. And you hit the nail on the head. The larger communities, there are a lot of great ones. So
Yes.
I know we always, for Say Joke, we always talk about smaller is better. And we personally feel that way because that's the resident that we cater to.
And you guys identified that there was a need in the marketplace for something that was smaller.
Absolutely.
Because we see what happens in some of the larger ones.
Yeah.
But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad. There's some really great ones out there. And there are things that they offer that smaller agencies, smaller communities can't.
Absolutely.
They got big theaters and they got pools
Yeah.
and they've got all the there's just a lot of,
Yeah,
there
we're
are a
not
lot
going
of
to be able to
amenities.
compete with that.
That's right.
And
That's
you're
right.
right. That it is the more independent, or even if they need assistance, but maybe not as much assistance, those residents do great in those communities. And I was executive director over some of those
That's
really
right. That's
large
right. Yeah.
National organizations. And there is a place for those in the market. Certainly, that's what's kind of dominating the market.
Yep.
But yes, at Sage Oak, we felt like there's not a lot of really great options for those residents that have higher acuity needs that maybe they could go to skilled nursing, but they don't necessarily have to.
Right.
And a lot of the larger assisted living and memory care communities, they're allowed to take that as far as regulatory wise, but on the legality side, they don't want to touch it as much because they do better catering to those more independent.
That's right.
So that's what Sage Oak falls in that gray area.
Yes.
So if it's someone that is thinking that maybe they need skilled nursing, don't know for sure, come and talk to us, because we may be an option, we may not, and we're happy to guide you to a good skilled nursing facility if that's the case. But yeah, the large ones definitely are great. We feel like we do high acuity and memory care really well at Sage Oak, because once you have that cognitive impairment piece onto it, you really do get lost in the mix in the larger areas. Smaller is certainly better when you're dealing with dementia and Alzheimer's. And with our caregiver ratios, that's one of the things that we feel like we do really well also.
That's true. I will concur.
Thank you. But you are able to really hone in and know that resident better. They get more caregiver hours per resident per day when you have the ratios.
That's right. And they've done some studies too, even on fall rates. If you compare large facility to small, I think when they said smaller, I think you may know, is it less than 25? I'm trying to remember the statistic, but it was something about really, really large ones, and then anything less than 20 or 25, whatever that number was, and it was like 25% fewer or 75% fewer falls. In smaller facilities than the larger ones, and a lot of that's just because the caregivers are present. There's enough of them there, around the clock.
Absolutely. And, when you talk about the ratios and kind of guiding people on when they're making that selection, I would also encourage them to ask the community who is included in that ratio, because sometimes communities will lump every employee in for their caregiver ratio, and that's fine because they're there, but if they're not the ones providing the actual caregiving, they might be the activities director, the chef, they may be maintenance, they may be...
And they'll certainly pop in and help out, so that's not to take that away, but their primary job is not on the caregiver side.
Who is actually on the floor doing the caregiving, really hone in on that, because we do that. So our caregiving ratios, in Denton, our homes are licensed for a max of 16 per house, and in assisted living we would have a minimum of one caregiver for every 8 residents. So if that house was full, we'd have 2 on each shift. But in addition to that, we have a chef that's in the house. It's not included in that caregiver ratio. We have an activities director, we have a nursing director, we have myself that are rounding through there. Dallas, we're licensed for 8. We have 1 caregiver for every 4 residents there. So we've got 2 on our day shifts there. And in memory care, we have 1 to 5. So we really try to focus on giving that one-on-one care.
It's almost double the caregiver ratio that you guys have versus the larger buildings.
And in doing that, we can help and be an extension. Like when you come and do therapy and you're also doing training for the caregivers, they can continue to try to practice with some of those, simpler exercises that don't require a therapist supervision when they're doing it. They can keep it going throughout the week until you guys are there to see them again.
Absolutely.
Are there any tips at home that you can give to people that may want to continue to strengthen, to prevent before something bad happens? Things they can do?
Maybe not tips, because tips is hard to do because it's always individual. But I can give you, there's a fascinating study that was done a couple years ago. And one of the things that we've known for a long time is that with deconditioning, the body, let me put it this way, with limited exercise or activity, the body does decline pretty fast.
Yes.
And in older folks, it declines even faster. And so they did a study a couple years ago, and they looked at a couple groups of people. One was, they were both over 65. One side was they put them through a 5-month exercise course. So they were doing resistance training. They also monitored their protein intakes and those kind of things. And in 5 months, the average participant in that study gained about 2.5 pounds of muscle mass. And they had another group, 65 plus, and they said, just lay in bed for 10 days. In 10 days, they lost the equivalent amount. So what took you 5 months to gain, you lost in 10 days. So I would say, as a preventative measure, it's really important that we move a lot, especially as we get older. And as we're getting to our older years, you want to make sure that you're maintaining your strength, because the muscle loss does pick up as in older years. So make sure that your protein intake is good. Talk with your doctors on that. There's a whole other longer discussion we can have on just the nutritional side of things that we as a healthcare community just miss.
Yeah, food is medicine.
We just don't do a good enough job on that. But for sure, the movement part of it, because that can help prevent some future immobility and debility issues as we go. And if you have a family member, or if you are a senior yourself, and you find yourself in a hospital environment or a skilled nursing facility environment, we don't see it as much in the SNFs anymore, but it's for sure in the hospital environment. I'm constantly advising family members to make sure that they advocate for getting therapy to come visit their mom and dad 2 or 3 times a day. Like I see too many of them coming out of the hospital where their new level is way down here, and you're like, man, you're just there for a week. And so I think mobility and moving is life.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you have a family member at home that has maybe had a recent traumatic event and is needing some home health therapy to come out, or if you are just interested in preventing something from happening, or just continuing to build that strength and keep it around, please give Brian Harmon a call at Nexus Home Health. Brian, how can they get in contact with you best?
We're on the web at nexushomehealthcare.com, and you can also email me at Brian, that's BRIAN, at nexushomehealthcare.com.
Perfect. I know we definitely plan to continue to keep in contact for our residents and pass that information along. Thank you very much for joining us today on the Sage Oak Show, Senior Care Simplified.